I'm Ray Andrewson. I grew up in North Haven, Connecticut. It's my hometown. I'm actually back living in my hometown once again.
And when you were a kid, what kind of road trips did you take?
We took a lot. My father's a traveling salesman for many years in eastern Canada, northeastern part of the United States. So he loved to get behind a wheel and drive, as I do still. So, and we also had a station wagon, a wonderful old Ford Galaxy that schlepped us around. We also had a Buick Skylark wagon at one time. So it wasn't uncommon for us to go to Cape Cod, to Cooperstown, New York, to the Baseball Hall of Fame, to Lake George, to go up to Sandus Village in Vermont to see Old Man in the mountain in New Hampshire, go to York, Maine, and rent a cottage and get in that icy cold waters. So we traveled through much of the Northeast, and we like to take the blue highways, the back roads especially, not just the main interstates. We didn't have to get there on deadline.
Nice. And then what kind of stops would you make? Were there places that you'd look for food or for amusements like miniature golf, or what kinds of stops would you make?
Well, we're all adult golfers now, but when you're young, we love mini golf. Miniature golf was a passion of mine, and I grew up as a child in the '60s and '70s. So in that era, we did stop at miniature golf sites to recreate. We would always find a wigwam on Route 2A in Massachusetts near North Adams, and that whole trail, the Mohawk Trail as it's called, not road. So we would stop at the kitschy places, and we actually would try to dine at some of the chains. I loved Howard Johnson growing up, and I think it was the ice cream that really drew me in, but some of those other types of foods, beef stroganoff, I guess was called beef burgundy or whatever they had on the menu, or some type of fried fish sandwich would be a big deal, and the onion rings. Nothing that I think a self-respecting adult should probably eat these days, but it was fun back then when you could handle the calories. Also, I think we went to in New England to farm shops where we can to get an Abigail sandwich or farm shops to get a fish-a-majig or a big beef or a watermelon sherbet cooler. That was things that I could eat when I was maybe 10 years old, but not now that I'm north of 50.
Right, exactly. And then now a lot of people had either special games they played in the car or traditions about who was going to sit where. Did you have any competition with brothers and sisters in the back of the station wagon?
Thankfully not. I'm an only child, so I really just competed against myself, I think, and I did sit in the back seat. This is pre-seatbelt days, of course, so I would hop from one seat behind my dad, who was always driving, so I'd be behind my father, and then I'd hop to the center, hop to the right, depending upon what I wanted to see. I love, even to this day, which is probably not a great habit for somebody, I love looking at things when I'm driving. And as a child, I would always look out the window and look at the posters and the billboards and all the signage and the houses and the buildings and the strip malls. Everything looked very interesting to me growing up. I think everybody who's gone south when we took a road trip in our Ford Galaxy station wagon to Florida saw those billboards for south of the border. And I just was so nonplussed and upset that in southern New Jersey, through Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, even into South Carolina, the south of the border always seemed to be just a few more miles away. And when we got there, it seemed big and huge to me as a child, but my parents and my aunt and my cousin who were traveling with us at the time weren't quite as excited as I was.
Tell us a little bit about, you mentioned that one of your passions, even as a young adult, was the local radio stations.
Yes. Well, I really didn't get tuned and plugged into that till the early 1970s when I was a little bit older, before my dad had the controls of the dial, and usually it was beautiful music stations or all news stations that I'd be listening to. And then I think I tortured him with top 40 music later on. And we did exactly that. We went to New Brunswick, Canada. I remember getting to the radio that was right bedside and trying to listen to a local radio station. And of course they had rock music on, and I think my parents wanted peace and quiet on their vacation. They didn't quite get it for the first few minutes. I didn't think they really wished to hear the Rolling Stones or you know, Temptations or anything else I was playing. But it was a passion, and it is still exciting to go into a new city, a new place, and discover those radio stations. And those radio stations had local flavor. If you were in Virginia, you'd heard a drawl. If you were in North Carolina, you heard a drawl. If you were traveling through parts of upstate New York, you heard the local voices, local restaurants were advertised, local pharmacies, and you really got a sense of the community. You were drawn into that by those stations.
Pat's 27 now, but when he was about 14, no matter where we went, he would look for the hip-hop station on the radio, and I didn't want to listen to hip-hop any more than your parents wanted to listen to the Rolling Stones. But, you know, in Connecticut, if you get as far south as sort of Bridgeport, Stamford, then you can get the New York stations,
Yes.
Hot 97, and so that's so funny. So I was like, as a parent, I've gone through that local radio station thing. Do you think that the exposure to those kinds of radio stations helped pique your interest in your career?
They did. I normally listen to them at home, and my dad's wonderful 1964 solid-state Grundig portable desktop radio, which I carried around as if it were a satchel or a briefcase around the house, listening all the time. And I was interested, really. Even before I really became very interested, even I think 6, 7, 8 years old, the radio was in my room. And car radios, of course, are about the open road, and particularly AM stations, so they would sound great from a distance, but you could put up with a certain level of static or a signal that isn't quite as strong. Today, nobody really wants to do that. I think they want clarity in all their audio. But we were more patient and forgiving of distant signals, DXing, long-distance listening of stations back then. And it was exciting for me to go into the Howard Johnson or to the Motor Lodge, the Holiday Inn, and also tune in the local TV stations and watch the local news. It was very exciting to learn a little bit about a community. You know, if you're in upstate New York or Maine, you would have a chance to watch 6 o'clock news and get a real taste of the community back then.
Well, some of the things that, starting in the 50s all the way through the 80s, that motels in particular would advertise, like Howard Johnson's, were that you'd have a color television, because everybody didn't yet have a color television at home. You'd have a pool, and you'd have air conditioning. So do you remember those in all the motels and hotels you stayed in as a kid?
Oh, boy, did I ever. And I was excited about it because at home we did not have air conditioning, we did not have a color TV till the mid-1970s, and we did not have a pool. So having these three luxuries were exciting to me as a kid because it really meant that I was experiencing something new and fresh, and a lot of that we take for granted today. So it was an experience to go into these places. So I really was excited when we pulled up to these motor lodges. I still remember the steeple, the orange steeple tower of the Howard Johnson, and that wonderful Holiday Inn logo. And also later on, the Ramada Inns that started to sprout up. And they had the faux Spanish decor with the red flocked wallpaper. Kitschy stuff from that era that I don't think anyone decorates in that style today.
I think Elvis decorated in that style.
Just about, yeah.
Exactly.
But it was a real deal because as after a long day of traveling on the road and being on the road for maybe 8, 9, 10 hours, to be able to get on a bathing suit and splash in a pool a little bit, go into the restaurant or a local restaurant and have a hot fudge sundae or something that today you don't really have as much more as a treat. It was a big deal, and it was always exciting. I really looked forward to the trips on the road. I also remember going on trips where toll booths were omnipresent, not just when we had them in Connecticut, because at that era we really did. The New Jersey toll booths were very exciting. The Mass Pike, and I love the logo for the Mass Pike with the little leprechaun's cap. At every state had different road signs. Today were sort of a hodgepodge. It was a hodgepodge. The Massachusetts boundary detectors for towns are still in existence. It's very interesting. You have the wonderful little logo on the top, and it's an iconic sign. I wish Connecticut kept theirs as well, and other states. Rhode Island, town boundary markers and state boundary markers were always new. I remember heading south and didn't know about the Maryland flag. The state of Maryland has a wonderful flag, the coat of arms for Lord Baltimore. And driving and seeing that flag to me was exciting. You know, we still have key, what is the Kiesel Transtulit Sustenit,
Yeah.
which is, I can't even say it in Latin, for Connecticut, and just the blue background. And our flag was kind of drab compared to the Maryland flag. The Maryland flag just was a burst of color, and seeing that everywhere on the highway, on the road signs in Maryland, it was kind of exciting.
Now, do you remember, was there anything special that you like to collect from in your different ages as you grew older?
I wasn't really much of a collector other than baseball cards and things of that nature. But it was, if you look back on that era, you know, we were all looking at cigarettes, and ashtrays were omnipresent, and my parents were smokers. My dad was a inveterate cigar smoker, and my mother smoked cigarettes. So because we were in the era where you could smoke everywhere, in the hotel rooms, in office buildings, in schools, in nurseries, I mean, just everywhere, and including restaurants, there was the omnipresent ashtray. So I think we had a few from Lake George. I do remember one from Lake George, one from York, Maine. They're gone. They're gone with the ages, like many things from that era, sadly, perhaps, unless you collect them. We didn't have much more than maybe we take up a placemat, those paper placemats that would be on a local diner or a local restaurant, and welcome to Maine or welcome to Pennsylvania, and they seemed kind of interesting to fold up and take home, and they usually would last maybe about a month. And then my mother would decide to throw them out because they had too many spaghetti stains on them. But I didn't really collect much, but it was, we did take a lot of photographs at one time, and at that point we were developing slides because we had a wonderful Argus slide projector, and the focus for light and dark contrast wasn't perfect, but we did have wonderful, we still have slide collection too of some of the trips. It seemed like we had global warming, though, in the 60s and 70s. My father couldn't focus the camera very well, so everything was overexposed, mostly overexposed. So it looked like we were getting invaded by Mars, and some, you know, bright lights were invading the globe at that point. So some of them are good pictures, some of them are not.
You can get those digitized now.
Yes.
So
yeah.
it would be fun for you to probably sort out the really good ones and have them digitized.
Well, when I get to retirement age, I figure I'll be able to look back and spend the time doing all these things and make it
Your
perfect.
family went slides, not video, not camera? You didn't
Camera came later. Camera was in the Instamatic cameras with the flash cubes that blinded everybody. Were what we used, I think, circa 1973 or 4. That came late into our lives. We had slides through the 70s, early 70s, and we still have them with a little Kodak imprint on the corner, Kodachrome. And they're, aside from the overexposure on many trips, they were largely of good quality. And we didn't take photographs in restaurants, and my father didn't really pay too much attention to taking photographs in iconic places other than museums, or maybe we went to, I recall, watching some local Floridians wrestle alligators, and there was some photograph of me with my Pittsburgh Pirates cap. I love Roberto Clemente, and a parrot on my shoulder. I mean, those type of shots. And I remember we took a great road trip to the expo in Montreal, Expo 70, and that meant foreign travel. Oh boy, Canada's so unusual. And also a fond memory I have is we went to see a baseball game in Jarry Park in Montreal, where the Montreal Expos beat the San Diego Padres 4-2, and Le Grand Orange, the Big Orange, because he had red hair, Rusty Staub hit a 3-run homer to win for the Expos, and it was exciting because they announced everything in French. And it felt so exotic to be in this strange place watching a American game, baseball game, and the public address announcer announced everything in French.
Now, you obviously had really wonderful memories of the road trips you took when you were young. What kind of road trips did you take with your children who are millennials?
Well, a millennial road trip is different, I think. They weren't particularly interested in color TV, vibrating beds, where you put a quarter in the slot and vibrate for a massage. They weren't as interested in, the pool was fun. I mean, I think they enjoyed that. Sadly, many pools now are indoors and they smell of chlorine. It's not quite as exciting as going outside. And we took one fabulous road trip, and it was ironic because it was just weeks before 9/11 in August of 2001. My wife's family, my in-laws, were in suburban Chicago and lived there at the time, so we embarked on a road trip in our Ford Taurus station wagon. And our first stop after heading out was an iconic spot in Cleveland, which is the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Definitely.
And our children were 9 and 6 at the time, so I don't think they were really jiving with Huey Lewis saying the rock and roll, heart of rock and roll is in Cleveland. They just saw it as a kind of a big city with a big lake near it, and they weren't too interested in that. But we stopped there and we saw an iron ore hauler, very big iron ore hauler in there. And afterwards, we continued on our way through Toledo to see a family friend, and then off to Chicago. And then after visiting family in Chicago, we came back through Michigan. And also our destination was Dearborn, Michigan, and Detroit. And we saw Greenfield, Henry Ford's Greenfield. And we drove into the city because Detroit is intriguing because of its dysfunction, and you keep hearing about all the problems. And we drove through this enormous, abandoned plant, the River Rouge plant for Ford Motor Company. And it was just this enormous, miles-long, hulking metal buildings that were abandoned. They're not in function anymore. And it sort of, for an adult, was eye-opening about our industrial decay and the Great Lakes cities, the great cities, they're becoming part of the Rust Belt. Our children weren't interested, obviously, as much in that, but I recall we went into East Dearborn, and 2 weeks before 9/11 saw signs in Arabic in this entire village. I didn't pay too much heed or attention. Did I know that Dearborn, Michigan, has one of the largest Muslim populations, and people from the South Asian and Middle Eastern nations and North African nations who live there, who have migrated here to the United States. And of course we know the history, sad history, weeks after that. But it was eye-opening, revealing. I had a wonderful dinner at Lashish that night, which is sort of a local haunt for Middle Eastern food. It was magnificent. And then after we left Detroit, we went through Ontario. So we crossed over the bridge into Canada and headed to Niagara Falls, which is a classic trip to take on the Canadian side, and spent a couple nights there. Then from Niagara Falls, we made our way to Cooperstown, New York, Baseball Hall of Fame.
Back to your haunt.
Where I just love Cooperstown. But it's better than baseball, Farmers Museum, Historical Society. You have a wonderful lake. It's a beautiful village too. And our boys loved it. We cherished that trip. And I think when 4 people, especially a 9 and a 6-year-old, are in the car with their parents, you can't just get out. You're stuck. So we played 20 questions, a lot. I think we did trivia games, a lot. I think we made up stories, and I recall Harry Potter was on the trip for long periods of time. And my wife would read to our children in the back seat part of the Harry Potter series to take away the miles, and I drove the car just as my dad did back in the day. So it was wonderful, and I would encourage anybody to go do that. Seeing America at sea level is not just the Amtrak slogan from years back, but to get out on those roads, the blue highways, to see the back roads of the United States. It was a wonderful trip.
If you had to just sort of close with an observation about the difference between when you take a road trip and when you fly somewhere.
I think on the road, in contemporary sense, you're stuck because we're now in an era when there are too many cars and you can't move as quickly. Also, there's still a lot of highways and byways, interstates. Sadly, the interstates are antiseptic. They don't really tell the story of the location you're in. I think if you're on Route 10 through New Orleans and Slidell, Louisiana, you have a lot more interesting things off the exit ramps.
If you're on the two-lane highways or the local highways.
Yeah, and so much of America has become fast food alley. It's become Walmarts. A lot of downtowns are struggling and suffering. In many parts of suburban and even exurban or rural America. But I think there's still something special about getting in a car, going on a two-lane road, going to a local diner or to a local iconic restaurant, tasting local food, going to a local history museum or a local historic site, and getting a sense of the culture of that area. And I think the problem is that naturally to drive 3,000 miles to San Francisco or to Washington State isn't very practical. You'd see some great stuff though on the way. It takes too long. And we have a problem today, I think, in our culture of destination-itis. And sometimes I think when we take these trips, some of the most enjoyable moments are in the unexpected, the things that you just sort of stumble upon that aren't planned. And it's hard. I've been in many airports, and I kind of know what they look like inside, but they all have the same theme. They all have the same Hudson News. They all have the same Froyo, the same McDonald's, and it's nowhere. But I love being on the road because at least you have the opportunity to divert yourself into a local, take in some local culture and local flavor. And that's the difference, I think, between flying and driving, is driving, when you have an opportunity, when you're unhurried, when you can take in the sights, really can be kind of edifying, kind of enjoyable. And even here in Connecticut, we have some wonderful back roads that people should explore and burn a few fossil fuel components to get there. And I love the open road.